y'all. This is Taylor Brough. This is part 3 of a 3-part video on the racial capitalism critique. If you have not watched parts 1 and 2, you should. They cover the history of the terminology in the Black radical tradition, and then kind of a quick how to do the debate things with it, how to think about how to make link arguments, and some recommendations for some alternatives and a couple of authors to check out. In this video, I'm going to cover half of it will be how to read this argument against K-affs, and half of it will be how to read this argument against plan-affs. These are not like the end-all be-all of what you can do with the critique, of course, but I'm hoping to provide some helpful like starting points for thinking about how to compete, and it's just some baseline ideas for how you might develop your own racial capitalism critique. So let's get started with how to read it against K-affs. As I said in the previous video, anytime you read a critique, you should really be thinking about how your alternative is going to compete with the aff. Remember, the alternative establishes competition, and the links provide reasons why the alternative is net beneficial to the plan or the method. So it's crucial that you have an alternative that competes with the aff. One of the easier ways to do this, the reason why the unraced Cap-K tends to be so successful in debate, is because you can basically defend vertical organizing as the alternative against many affs that have more local or micropolitical lenses for resistance. And so an example of a vertical organizing alternative would be like dual power or something like that, that advocates building counterhegemonic institutions, that can do the work of, building Black socialist or Black communist power against the state. And so those institutions would build and seize state power. And a lot of the offense that people tend to generate with those alternatives is about how localized sites of resistance can often fracture coalitional possibilities, or can even prevent people from seeing that racial capitalism is what conditions, what's messed up about the life that they're currently leading. And so that can be helpful for framing out the aff in 2 ways. One is that you can indict basically the aff's praxical frame, the aff's frame of what kinds of actions, what kinds of actions the affirmative would do on a small scale. You can claim that those actions represent attempts to survive or palliatives, right? That ultimately preserve the status quo by asking people to be increasingly resilient to increasingly precarized, I don't know if that's a word, but to the conditions of their lives being made increasingly mobile and precarious as a result of developments of racialized neoliberalism. So that's one indict that you can make. The second one that I think can be helpful is that you can indict the aff's model of organization, right? A lot of critical affirmatives like to talk a big game about things like revolt, or about modes of resistance, or micropolitical acts, or reorientations of the self. And a racial capitalism critique with a dual power alternative, for example, or another alternative that's focused on building sustainable organizations, can make the argument that it's necessary to have some kind of institutional organizational capacity in order to sustain revolt, because otherwise those revolts tend to fall apart, because like following them, people will get arrested, or there will be crackdown, or, all kinds of things. And without an organization that can, or a series of organizations that can be committed to linking up national and transnational struggles, then it's going to be really, really difficult to, sustain revolutionary energy beyond just protests in the streets. So that's one way to think about how you would read a racial Cap-K against critical affirmatives. Of course, you also want your other genres of links in there, not just links to what the method does, but also links to how the aff conceptualizes and thinks about themselves or the world, or et cetera. That's where people get links about resiliency, victimization, seeking recognition, mimetic forms of subjectivity that mimic colonizers, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of links in there. How to read the racial cap K against plan affs. There are a billion and one ways, like I said before, to think about how to do this. Obviously, again, you want an alternative that competes with the aff. That's much easier to do when you're debating a plan aff, particularly one that's harder, right? But you can also read this criticism against some of the soft lefty plan affs. Because you basically, in essence, what you're trying to do is make arguments about how the aff's modality of politics is predicated on things like dispossession and expropriation. So, excuse me, so you're trying to prove that the way that the aff has approached politics is predicated on racially capitalist modes of recognition, on celebrations of multiculturalism, on approaches that attempt to integrate Black people, Native people, other peoples of color into a racially capitalist order in order to preserve it. They're an attempt to protect the status quo. So, and then you would want alternatives that allow you to talk about the proliferation of revolt, about the necessity for revolutionary violence, about the necessity for, Black communist organizing or dual power organizing or intercommunalism or et cetera, et cetera. Another way to think about this is to think about social reproduction, right? That the aff, when it's a plan aff particularly, but in general, has a modality of politics that it attempts to socially reproduce. What it socially reproduces are the conditions of racial capitalism. What the alternative is attempting to socially reproduce is an alternative to it, right? That is also in contest with racial capitalism. And so you would want to build out a bunch of link arguments, like I said in the previous talk, that are really centered on the question of dispossession and expropriation, and also how the aff, comes to know the things, right? What the structural positionality of the aff is as well. So I know that was very brief, but hopefully that gives you some starting point ideas for how you might operationalize this argument in different debates. And yeah, best of luck to all of you who are trying to read racial capitalism critiques. They're really important, and I hope that you find success with them.